Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a battling stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
The work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.
Good morning. Our first item today is general questions. Question number one was not lodged. Question number two, Margaret Mitchell.
Also to ask the Scottish Government what it's doing to tackle fly tipping.
Cabinet Secretary Rosanna Cunningham.
Fly tipping is primarily a matter for local authorities, but it is illegal, it is unnecessary. Valuable resources which could be recycled go to waste, and it creates an expensive problem, often with costs met from the public purse. We have provided the revised Code of Practice on Litter and Refuse, given local authorities and SEPA powers to fine people at least £200 up to a maximum fine of £40,000 if prosecuted, and we've also consulted on new powers to seize vehicles linked to waste crime in our recent circular economy legislation consultation, new powers which could be utilised to tackle fly tipping.
Margaret Mitchell.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. She may recall I raised this issue in June last year with the Minister for Rural Affairs and Natural Environment and pointed out that in England and Wales the court can make an order requiring an individual convicted of fly tipping to pay for the costs of clear-up. Given that one of the aims of the rural crime strategy is to stop organised crime benefiting financially from fly tipping, does the Cabinet Secretary consider that the use of court orders in Scotland to recover the fly tipping clear-up costs would help meet the rural crime strategy's aim, but also, more importantly, provide financial assistance to local authorities and private landowners who currently incur these costs?
Cabinet Secretary.
We will always look at potential, I won't say solutions, but changes that might help the situation, and that would be one of the things that I would need to speak to colleagues in other portfolios about, as the member probably is aware, given her own personal background. There are other things, of course, that are happening, and we do need to remember that any decisions regarding the kind of issue that the member has raised, or include others, tend to come on the back of a successful core action. And the issue is getting this fly tipping issue into court, which is a matter between the relevant local authorities and the Crown Office. So there are real issues around this, as there often are in these sorts of cases, and we are trying to keep across that. There is also, and the member may be aware, the Scottish Partnership Against Rural Crime published their rural crime strategy last year, and fly tipping was one of the 7 priorities for Spark. So we are trying to get on top of this, but I do appreciate the enormous nuisance this causes and the concern to many, many communities.
Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary provide an update on what plans the Scottish Government has to review the National Litter Strategy?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as the member may realise from what I've said, we are committed to reducing littering and delivering against the National Litter Strategy, which goes quite widely in comparison to the very specific issue of fly tipping. In 2018, we published the updated Code of Practice on Litter and Refuse, and we do intend to bring forward legislation for a new penalty regime for littering from vehicles as part of the Circular Economy Bill, and that was an ask that came from a number of different places. These are commitments we made in the National Litter Strategy, which also contains a commitment to conduct a review in 2020, and we are currently considering how best we can take that review forward this year.
Thank you. Question number 3, Maurice Corry.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions it has had with NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde to secure and develop services at the Vale of Leven Hospital in light of the announcement that its out-of-hours service unit is to temporarily close at evenings and weekends.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
As the member will know, the NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde is at level 4 escalation. Part of that is for the sustainability and robustness of the out-of-hours services. That involves the turnaround director, Callum Campbell, and an oversight board chaired by NHS Scotland's Chief Operating Officer. The intention is, given that the 9 centres are not sustainable over the recent period, is to pause that, fix 4 of them, and then establish it out to the 9. Meantime, in Western Bartonshire, the Vale of Leven's medical assessment unit remains open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The minor injuries unit is open from 8 AM till 9 PM every day, including weekends. Overnight GP out-of-hours service continues to operate 7 nights a week from 11 PM until 8 AM, and GP home visiting cover is there for the whole region. With the local campaign group, Hospital Watch, Greater Glasgow and Clyde is working with the Vale of Leven's lead clinician for integrated care and local GPs to improve the robustness of that particular service so that we have full out-of-hours cover over the evenings and at weekends, and that I expect to see in the very near future.
Maurice Corry.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for her answer. The serious cutbacks of the out-of-hours service in the Vale of Leven Hospital presents major challenges, for example, for constituents who will struggle to find public transport during antisocial hours to take them to hospital for treatment, and also for already stretched A&E departments who will now face increasing pressure to meet demand. For the sake of the local community care, will the Cabinet Secretary commit to preserving the Vale of Leven services and recognise that this vital lifeline cannot afford to be curtailed without consultation?
Cabinet Secretary.
So, to Mr Corry, I would make a number of points. First of all, as I've said, home visiting is available throughout the region. Secondly, as I think I've made crystal clear on more than one occasion, I am absolutely committed to the Vale of Leven as an important site of healthcare. There are a number of services that are now available in the Vale, everything from renal dialysis, haematology, day ward, dermatology, birthing unit, and so on. And I know that Mr Corry knows that and is himself personally committed to increasing those services as I am. This is a temporary step The Vale of Leven's position in terms of out of hours will be finalised and completed in its entirety very soon. Those 4 out-of-hours services will then, all the steps taken with advanced nurse practitioners, rotas, GPs engagement and so on, be made robust. That will be the model then to then increase the number of out-of-hours units in a robust way to 6 or 7 and then to 9 over a period of 12 to 18 months. So all of that work is in hand, but meanwhile, Vale News has produced what I have read for, which is a joint publication from Greater Glasgow and Clyde and Hospital Watch, which sets out what the current services are, some of which will prevent, because they are indeed very effective services, not least a minor injuries unit, that will prevent further pressures on A&E.
Got 2 more members wish to ask on this, to slightly more concise questions and answers. Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that the Health Board must fully take on board the issues and the concerns of both residents who go to the Vale of Leven Hospital and also the Inverclyde Royal Hospital to ensure that additional services can actually be introduced at both of these hospitals?
Cabinet Secretary.
And not only do I agree with the member, but I think my commitment in both of those areas is crystal clear. Level 4 escalation allows us to be much more engaged with the board in terms of directing where its priorities should lie and how it delivers those, and we will continue to do that and update members accordingly.
Jackie Bailey.
The Cabinet Secretary came to visit the Vale of Leven Hospital almost a year ago to discuss the out-of-hours service, and she made a very welcome commitment to consider a locally organised and delivered service. Can she therefore explain why NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde thought they could simply ignore this, and what steps she will take to restore the service at the Vale and sack the Chair and Chief Executive of the Health Board?
Cabinet Secretary.
So indeed I did make that visit, and I'm very happy to visit again and meet that campaign group again, as I've discussed previously, most recently with Ms Bailey. It is inexplicable to me why the board did not take up the offer from those GPs, the GPs who themselves actually run many of the services I've just run through. What I can assure Ms Bailey is that that will no longer be ignored, and that those services will continue to benefit from the significant commitment of that GP group in the Vale of Leven, and we will return very swiftly to a full out-of-hours service in the Vale.
Thank you. Question number 4, Beatrice Wishart.
To ask the Scottish Government how it ensures that transport services meet the needs of island communities.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
We are committed to providing a transport system that works for communities across Scotland, including our island communities. That is why, since 2007, despite real terms reductions by the Yuki Government, the Scottish Government has invested over £2 billion in ferry services across the country, including new routes, new vessels, upgraded harbour infrastructure and cheaper fares. Northlink ferries recorded a satisfaction rating of 97% last year. Close engagement with communities has been vital to investment in services and will continue as we develop the new Strategic Transport Projects Review and the successor to the Ferries Plan.
Beatrice Wishart.
I thank the Minister for his answer. I've been contacted by several constituents and visitors to Shetland who have complained about the high cost of getting to the Isles. I know of someone who was charged almost £500 for the return flights from Edinburgh to visit family in Shetland for Christmas. When families have crises and need to travel to or from the mainland, these costs make a situation that is already stressful even worse. The Government has a role in these extortionate costs as the owner of High Isle. Does the Minister agree with me that Isles passengers are being penalised, and will he set out what the Government will do to make sure that people are not charged over the odds?
Minister.
Well, I think the first thing to say is to acknowledge to Beatrice Wishart and indeed other islands representatives, we recognise the challenges that island communities face in actually making journeys to the mainland and the high costs that there are of travel. Obviously, the Government is doing everything we can to try and maintain the lower costs for those that are having to either commute to the mainland or indeed travel for business or pleasure. And we will continue to do that. My colleague Michael Matheson is obviously clearly working very hard to ensure that High Isle takes its responsibilities to island communities seriously, but I'm more than happy to meet with Ms Wishart to discuss any particular issues that she's aware of and take that forward with my colleagues.
Rhoda Grant.
The 18-19 budget granted £10.5 million funding for inter-island ferry services in Orkney and Shetland. This came with a promise of finding a sustainable solution for inter-island ferry services, which are a lifeline to their communities. Can I ask when these islands can expect to find a sustainable solution for inter-island ferry services?
Minister.
Well, clearly, the Government is keen to work with all parties in this chamber as we approach budget process, and I know Ms Forbes is hoping to cement the budget in Parliament very shortly. But I would certainly encourage the member to engage with me. As she knows, we've been working very hard with Orkney Islands Council, Shetland Islands Council, Argyll and Bute Council to try and find long-term solutions for their internal ferry services. I'm pleased to say we have provided a solution this year in the budget, should it be approved by Parliament, to resolve issues in Argyll and Bute. We have continued discussions with Orkney Islands Council and Shetland Islands Council. There are specific issues in relation to both, in relation to differences in terms of their fit with the routes and services model, with fare structures, and indeed with the funding arrangements as they already stand, and they are complex, but I certainly would commit to the member we can continue those discussions with colleagues in both Orkney Islands and Shetland Islands and try and come to a solution as soon as we can.
Kenny Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Minister, in light of the Scottish Government's decision to extend free bus travel to under 18s, what consideration will it give to allowing young island residents on islands such as Cumbria and Arran, for example, to travel free on ferries?
Minister.
Well, I certainly recognise Mr Gibson's strong commitment to trying to resolve and improve indeed services for residents in Cumbria and Arran and other parts of his constituency. We have committed to a national concessionary travel scheme for free bus travel for those 18 and under from January 2021, subject to the completion of the necessary preparations, including due diligence and research. We'll be engaging with young people across the country to ensure that all areas benefit from these measures. Existing support is provided for young people on ferries through the Young Scot National Entitlement Card, namely for young people aged between 16 to 18 who live on islands, who receive in turn 4 vouchers for a single trip or 2 returns from islands to the mainland. In addition, under 16s travel for half the adult fare, and under 5s travel completely free. But obviously keen to hear from Mr Gibson if he has any specific proposals.
Jamie Halcro Johnston.
Thank you. This year's budget has shown that once again the Scottish Government has no serious ambition to genuinely deliver fair funding for Orkney and Shetland's ferries. So can I ask the Minister, will he go into next year's Scottish Parliament elections once again making promises to the islands that he has no intention whatsoever of keeping?
Minister.
I think the member has some degree of brass neck, Presiding Officer, on this issue. It is Mr Halcro Johnston's colleagues in the Yuki government who have failed to provide a budget in advance of the Scottish Government budget that creates significant uncertainty for the Finance Secretary and this Government in pushing forward a budget in advance of knowing what we are going to receive from UK ministers. Now, if the member is serious about commitments to fair funding for services in Orkney Islands and Shetland Islands, I'm sure he must have made representations to Ms Forbes in the budget process to include additional funding for ferries in Orkney Islands and Shetland Councils. If he has not, he is guilty of gross hypocrisy, and that's something that he should reflect on.
Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Given news this week of the agreement between the Council and the Scottish Government over funding a replacement for the Golden Mariana, can the Minister confirm that this will now pave the way for agreement for the replacement of other vessels within a fleet that provides a genuine lifeline to the island communities in the constituency of Orkney that I represent?
Minister.
Well, the first thing I would do, in all seriousness, I know this is a genuine question on behalf of Mr MacArthur and his constituents, that in terms of the agreement we are trying to reach with Orkney Islands Council, yes, we are trying to provide additional funding to help with that particular instance. We've got ongoing discussion with Orkney Islands Council, as Mr MacArthur will know, about the longer-term position for Orkney Islands ferries. Clearly, these are complex, as I outlined in my answer to Rhoda Grant, around differences in fare structures, alignment with the RSM model, which in the case of Orkney we believe is below the RSM standard, and we are having ongoing discussions with Orkney Islands Council. These are not easy matters given the funding constraints we live in, but I assure Mr MacArthur and indeed Mr Halcro Johnston that we are continuing to have those discussions with the Council and will look to try and find a long-term solution for the islands.
And David Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Minister will be well aware of the breaking news overnight that regional airline Flybe has collapsed, with 2,000 jobs at risk across the United Kingdom. Will the Minister raise this issue urgently with the First Minister, who I know is in her place, to assess the job losses in Scotland and provide specific aviation support in Highlands and Islands, such as endorsing the public service obligation for Wick to Aberdeen service?
Minister.
Well, these are very important matters. I know the First Minister and the Cabinet Secretary, Mr Matheson, or actually Mr Matheson is very much actively dealing with this as at present, and reassure the member this is obviously a very serious situation. And first of all, I should say our thoughts about the staff that are involved in Flybe. It's obviously a horrendous situation they face, and obviously for those customers who've been affected by the actions overnight. In relation to the Highlands Islands region, which the member represents, I just want to put on record, Flybe do not operate in any of the islands at present, but Flybe's franchise partner, Eastern Airways, operates the Aberdeen Wick service, and they have confirmed they'll continue to operate this, which is obviously great news for those served by the Wick Airport.
Question number 5, Jamie Halcro-Johnston.
To ask the Scottish Government how it will ensure that all information required and requested by the OECD as part of the review of the Curriculum for Excellence will be made available.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, the OECD has provided the Scottish Government with guidance on the gathering of background information and evidence to inform the review. We will be working closely with our national partners to provide a comprehensive evidence base at the outset and to ensure that the review process itself captures the views, experiences of a broad range of partners, practitioners and learners.
Jamie Halcro-Johnston.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for the answer. He'll be aware that the Education Committee of this Parliament has on several occasions found it difficult to access all the necessary data from Scotland's education agencies. He'll also know that several of Scotland's education experts have been concerned that Scotland is not as data-rich as it should be when it comes to measuring educational attainment. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what actions the Scottish Government is taking to ensure that there is better qualitative evidence available ahead of the OECD review, covering a breadth of areas?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm afraid Mr Halcro-Johnston is having a bad day on the questions today, Presiding Officer, because Scotland has never had more information about the performance of individual pupils through our education system at any point in the last 20 or 30 years. And that has come about. By the reforms that this government has made to ensure that we deliver improvements in performance. We now know the information about the performance of young people at Curriculum for Excellence levels, at early level, level 1, level 2, level 3, information that was never available in the past. So Mr Halcro-Johnston needs to get up to date with the statistics and understand the reforms this government has put in place and why young people in our country should be proud of the performance they're delivering in Scottish education.
Question 6, Joanne Lamond.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what support it provides to young disabled people in the transition to adulthood.
Minister Marie Todd.
Presiding Officer, there are already a number of policies and initiatives underway to support the needs of disabled children and young people going through transitions, but we all recognise the need for something more. A number of important aspects of transitions are already covered by legislation in Scotland. Across the Scottish Government directorates, there are over 30 projects or programmes already being progressed to effect real change to the transitions experience for our young people. We will build on this to maximise impact through greater coordination of work across Scottish Government. We'll also ensure that planning for transitions is integrated into good practice through the upcoming refresh of the Getting It Right for Every Child policy and practice guidance. We'll ensure that the voices of lived experience of children and young people and families feature strongly in our policy development.
Joanne Lamond.
Thank you. I'm sure the Minister is aware of how important a time this is for young disabled people as they face transition to adulthood. But despite what she says, the provision simply is not working, and young disabled people face significant barriers because of their disability. The Minister may also be aware of my proposed Members' Bill, which seeks to address the absence of support for disabled young people as they become adults. Given the powerful testimonies I have received in response to my consultation about the lack of serious planning and the abandonment of families at this important time, will the Cabinet Secretary agree to meet with me to discuss my bill proposal and how best we secure the rights of disabled young people to secure the support they need to achieve their potential as adults?
Minister.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Minister. Now, before we turn to First Minister's questions, I'm sure members would like to join me in welcoming to our gallery the Right Honourable Catherine Hara MP, Speaker of the Parliament of Malawi. Thank you. We turn now to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Jackson Carlo.
Presiding officer, this week the coronavirus spread to Scotland. The First Minister and the Scottish Government can be assured it will have both my full and engaged support and that of all Scottish Conservatives as it deals with the virus. And in turn, can I thank the First Minister for the constructive way she has worked with the UK Government, just as she did with previous health pandemics some years ago. Both of Scotland's governments need to work together constructively and effectively. Now, in recent weeks, 2 testing facilities have been set up in Glasgow and Edinburgh, with positive results sent to the Public Health England for confirmation. Does the First Minister envisage that these 2 labs can meet all of the anticipated demand for initial testing, or can she indicate whether there are contingency plans to further expand testing capacity in Scotland as required?
First Minister.
Can I thank Jackson Carlaw for his comments and for his statement about support from the Scottish Conservatives. We face a potentially very serious situation, and I think all of us have a responsibility to work together to make sure that our response is what the people of Scotland would expect. Before I turn to the specific of Jackson Carlaw's question, can I simply confirm to Parliament that as of this morning we have 6 confirmed cases. I would expect that to rise possibly very rapidly in the days to come. I also want to stress that we are still very much in what is called the contain phase of the virus in Scotland. If people follow the advice, if we ensure that confirmed cases are isolated, that contacts are traced and given appropriate advice, and if the public follow the advice on hand and other personal hygiene, then we can continue to have a degree of success in stopping the spread from individual to individual, and it is important that we do that for as long as possible. That said, I think we all recognise and accept that it looks increasingly unlikely that we will be able to contain this outbreak indefinitely. So therefore, it is likely that we will move into what is called the delay phase of the virus, and that may be reasonably soon, but that will be guided by the best scientific advice. When we're in that phase, the focus is very much on seeking to slow down the spread and reduce the peak, reduce the number of people who are infected at any one time. And it is important that as we take decisions around that, then we are informed by good quality scientific advice. There will be difficult decisions potentially involved in this. Ministers will not take them lightly, but equally we will not hesitate in doing exactly what is required to protect the public as long and as best as we possibly can. In terms of testing, we took early action to ensure that testing facilities were available in Glasgow and Edinburgh. There are plans to both in Tayside and Grampian to potentially have testing facilities there. I am satisfied at this stage that we have the capacity to deal with that. As with any outbreak, and I'm not saying we are close to that at the moment here, but as with any outbreak, we may reach a point of the spread being such that not every individual is tested, because the presumption will become that if they are ill with certain symptoms, then they have the virus. But we're not at that stage right now, and we'll continue to take the actions that we require to take.
Jackson Carlaw.
I thank the First Minister for that, and of course, in consequence of a rapidly rising number of cases, if that does transpire, one emerging issue is likely to be the availability of beds. Now, healthcare in the past few years has shifted from hospitals into the community, with specialist services concentrated into one place in larger hospitals. In consequence, we have fewer beds, fewer smaller community hospitals, and that's happened in response to changes in demographics, technology and medicine. Now, given that the Chief Medical Officer has suggested a full outbreak will require more intensive hospitalisation, can the First Minister indicate how many extra beds may be required and what contingency plans are being prepared to commission them?
First Minister.
Well, in terms of numbers, that is amongst the things that we are currently assessing and will assess on an ongoing basis. I think it would be premature to give numbers on that right now, but it is likely that we will need increased facilities for hospital care, including intensive hospital care, but also be prepared to treat more people in the community who can be treated in the community in order to ensure that our hospital capacity is there for those who need it most. The NHS has well-established escalation plans in place. They are in the process of being implemented. The Health Secretary and I, through the Scottish Government Resilience Committee and indeed in day-to-day planning,
are overseeing that and making sure that they are being refined and developed as we go. We are still, and I think this is a point that would be made not just in every country in the UK, but in every country across the world right now, we are still in a phase of learning more about the operation of this virus. Our knowledge is incomplete, and that makes it all the more important that we have plans in place that are well established and developed, but are also flexible enough to respond to the reality as we face it. And the Scottish Government will continue to ensure that that work is done.
Jackson Carlo.
Yep. Again, I thank the First Minister for that response. Now, we know from previous outbreaks of pandemics that protecting our own dedicated health workforce will be essential. However, staffing in the NHS is already under significant pressure. It is, after all, the end of winter, with staff already sprinting to stand still. Now, the UK Government has announced that they intend to recruit retired doctors and nurses to augment and support the health service in England and Wales. Can the First Minister advise whether a similar initiative will now progress in Scotland and how this will be achieved if required?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, can I take the opportunity, and I'm sure it will be echoed across the Chamber, to pay tribute to our frontline NHS staff. We do that each and every day, but at times like this, the pressure and demand on them increases, and we are all appreciative of the work that they do. I visited NHS 24 in Clyde Bank yesterday, who of course are amongst our healthcare workers who are at the sharp end of that increased demand. We have record numbers of people working in our NHS in Scotland. They work incredibly hard and under incredible pressure, but nevertheless the numbers have been increasing. We also have more staff per head of population than other parts of the UK, so that is not to diminish the pressure they are under now or will be under, but that is an important foundation. Of course, we are also looking at contingency plans to encourage and ask those who are recently retired from the National Health Service to come back if that is required. We are obtaining lists of retired healthcare professionals from, for example, the Royal College of Nursing, the Royal College of Midwives. We're looking to get that from the General Medical Council as well. So these plans are underway. What I would say in terms of seeking to assure the public, I think it's, and this was an approach that I thought was very important during the swine flu pandemic just over a decade ago, it's very important to be frank and honest with the public and give as much information as possible. But also to seek to reassure the public that while this is a serious situation being taken seriously, there are well-established plans in place and they are in the process of being implemented. It's also very important that I think that we continue to reassure the public that although there are very big numbers being cited right now, we are planning on the basis of worst-case scenarios. But whatever the numbers turn out to be, the vast majority of people will have mild symptoms. And part of our focus in seeking to reduce the number infected at any one time is to minimise as much as possible the impact on society and in particular the impact on our National Health Service. And that's the basis on which we'll continue to take our planning work forward.
And Jackson Carlo.
Yeah, and finally on that very reassurance point, as we've seen from the development of the virus in other parts of the world, it's the most vulnerable groups that could be most susceptible. Now, without in any way wishing to be alarmist, many people watching who are going through cancer and other treatments with compromised immune systems will clearly be concerned. Has the First Minister considered how we offer specific reassurance and target resources at that most vulnerable group, who obviously will be inevitably particularly affected and concerned?
First Minister.
Well, I know the public generally will have a degree of anxiety right now, reading what they're reading in the newspapers, watching what they're watching on the television, but that will be heightened for those who already suffer vulnerabilities, whether they are health vulnerabilities or the vulnerabilities that come with age. And it's important, I think, generally, going back to the point I made earlier on, that all of us as politicians, and I as First Minister, take this responsibility very seriously, that we are frank and honest with people, but that we don't seek to sensationalise, and that we also base our decisions on good quality scientific advice, not on reasons of political expediency. And I think that's important for all of us. In order to reassure people in those groups, though, I would again talk about the importance of the containment phase. We may not be able to contain this virus indefinitely, but every day we manage that, and every week we manage that, taking a potential future peak out of the winter period and into spring and summer, then we help to reduce the impact. So the message is right now to all of us to wash our hands properly, to ensure that we follow the advice of what to do when we cough and sneeze. I'm very aware that politicians telling people how to wash their hands sounds patronising, but it is really, really important. All of us, those of us who are healthy, doing that helps to protect those who are more vulnerable. But also in all of our planning for potential escalation, making sure that we are targeting resources to the most vulnerable is absolutely at the top of our priority list. So I do appreciate from across the Chamber the support as we take forward these plans. I will say again that I think this is a potentially very serious situation. But we are not powerless in the face of this. There are many things we can do and will do to reduce the impact of this as much as possible. And that's what I am very, very focused on as First Minister, as is the Health Secretary and indeed the entire government.
Thank you. Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I begin by reminding members of my register of interests and in particular my membership of the GMB Trade Union. Presiding Officer, the first thoughts of all of us are with those patients diagnosed with coronavirus COVID-19. The importance of a single island, UK-wide approach when infection outbreaks know no boundaries is paramount, and we welcome the unified and cohesive response to date. We also welcome the cross-party approach which has been taken by the First Minister and her Cabinet Secretary for Health. It is clear that we must all follow the advice of the experts, the World Health Organization scientists, the frontline health professionals and the Chief Medical Officer. Can the First Minister tell us, firstly, how quickly people can expect to be tested? And secondly, what steps are being taken to train and equip staff who will be involved in community testing?
First Minister.
Well, people can expect to be tested very quickly if they contact the National Health Service and if they fit the case definition, which has changed and will undoubtedly continue to change. But if they fit the case definition, both in terms of travel history or contact with people who have travelled to certain countries and the symptoms that they are experiencing, they will be tested quickly. They will be given all of the appropriate advice. And of course, that is the process that has led to the confirmation of the six cases that we have right now. Those tests are being carried out in Scotland, in Glasgow and Edinburgh. There are plans afoot to have another testing facility. I think it is, I may have said Grampian to Jackson Carlaw earlier on. If I did, I apologise. I meant to say Tayside. And those plans will continue to be progressed. And we will continue to ensure that staff have the right support and have the right training for anything that they are being asked to carry out. But that testing capacity, I think, is adequate at this time. But as with all aspects of our planning here, it is kept under ongoing review.
Richard Leonard.
Can I thank the First Minister for that answer? The Coronavirus Action Plan, agreed to by the 4 governments in the UK, includes a commitment to support early discharge from hospital if active transmission becomes established among the population here. We know from the government's own figures released just 2 days ago that the delayed discharge of patients from Scotland's hospitals has reached record levels. In the last 24 hours, I've spoken to council leaders who are concerned that our social care system may not have the necessary resources to enable patients to be discharged on time at present. So can the First Minister outline how the government plans to alleviate these concerns and so ensure that, if required, the action plan can be implemented in full?
First Minister.
Well, reducing delayed discharge is a focus for the government. It is, regardless of coronavirus, but particularly so given the challenge we face with coronavirus. Reflecting that, the Health Secretary met with COSLA yesterday to discuss this. We'll be meeting with the Chief Officers of Integration Authorities later today. Obviously, we have the budget this afternoon. I don't want to get into political territory here, but the budget includes increased resources for local authorities and indeed increased resources for social care. That is important. It may be that through discussions with the UK Government, we have a requirement for further increasing in NHS and social care resources as a result of this challenge that we are facing. So there is rather an intensive focus on ensuring that we can discharge people appropriately. That's important at any time, but at a time when we are facing the need for greater hospital capacity for those who need it most, then it is a particular focus. And the Health Secretary, as with all aspects of our planning here, will keep Parliament fully updated.
Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, we have heard again this week that a business case is being made to Scottish ministers to close half of our NHS laundries so that only 4 would be left to serve the whole of mainland Scotland. And we know that trade unions have raised concerns about this. We also know that the GMB has written to the First Minister this week asking for, and I quote, a moratorium on cleaning cuts across councils. They have also called for any additional demands and so additional costs on local councils to be met by the Scottish Government. So will the First Minister today give an undertaking to ensure that the necessary funding and resources are available to councils and the NHS? Will she place a moratorium on the plans to close down 4 of Scotland's NHS mainland laundries? Also, that we can reduce risks, manage this emergency, keep staff safe and protect the health of the people of Scotland.
First Minister.
Well, can I take those issues in turn? I think Richard Leonard referred to a letter that I had received from the GMB. I can confirm that they did indeed write to me about council cleaning services. Again, if I can point to the increased resources for local government in the budget that hopefully Parliament will pass this afternoon. But I would also say we've provided advice on cleaning educational settings through the COVID-19 guidance that has been produced by Health Protection Scotland. That remains extremely important, and we will be, of course, including COSLA in our ongoing resilience planning to make sure that they are engaged with the actions that we are taking. In terms of laundries, the Laundry Programme Board has been seeking to develop a new action plan to ensure that their services are safe and sustainable. No proposals relating to this have come to ministers to consider. We have been waiting on NHS Chief Executives to review the business case. Of course, the final decision will be taken by the Cabinet Secretary for Health, and she has already said, I think, but if not, I will say it today, that the current and emerging situation with coronavirus will be very much a factor in deciding the best way forward for this. So there will be no plans approved by the Scottish Government that we think in any way puts at risk the steps that we have to take to deal with this situation. On the question of resources, I've made points about the budget we are going to pass for the next financial year today. But of course, when that draft budget was put together, we did not have all of the information we have now in terms of coronavirus. I think it is almost inescapably the case that we will be required to provide additional resources to health and to social care and perhaps to other parts of our public services and indeed businesses and individuals who are dealing with this challenge. Clearly, the Scottish Government budget is fully committed, and we will require to have discussions with the UK Government ahead of and no doubt after the budget, the UK budget next week, to make sure that those decisions are taken in an appropriate way. And again, as with all aspects, we will keep Parliament duly updated on all of that.
Thank you very much. We're going to have a few supplementary constituency questions. The first from Annabel Ewing, to be followed by Gail Ross. Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Given the further unplanned elevated flaring by Exxon at Mismoran this week, just a few short weeks after the last major incident, the First Minister will understand how weary my constituents are of the whole thing. Does the First Minister agree that we have moved beyond the final warning issued by SEPA last year and that all necessary steps must now be taken as a matter of urgency by the regulator and by the operator, failing which the licence to continue to operate must surely be brought into question?
First Minister.
Well, can I firstly say to Annabel Ewing that I absolutely understand, as she described it, the weariness of her constituents, and I understand and indeed share the concern of local people. To put it mildly, it is extremely disappointing that there was a further flaring incident on Tuesday, so soon after the restart of the plant, and I know that this will have added greatly to the frustration felt by the local community. SEPA shares that disappointment and are urgently seeking detailed information on this latest incident. The Environment Secretary spoke to SEPA and the Health and Safety Executive after the previous episode to understand the action that they are taking, and I understand SEPA's focus is to follow through on the requirements it has placed on the operator to reduce the frequency and impact of flaring. This involves major works at the plant, and it will take time to see the full benefit, but I am absolutely clear that, and I agree with Annabel Ewing on this, that the operator must take all necessary steps to reduce the impact on residents and fully address their concerns.
Gail Ross, to be followed by Bob Doris. Gail Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware of the situation with Flybe going into administration. This has unfortunately left passengers having to make alternative arrangements with no certainty that they will be reimbursed. Beyond that, however, are the staff of Flybe who this morning find themselves without a job through no fault of their own. Can the First Minister give an indication of what engagement the Scottish Government has had with the airline about the kind of support that will be made available to these staff?
First Minister.
Well, can I share Gail Ross's sentiments about the collapse of Flybe, but in particular I want to echo her comments about the staff. My thoughts are very much with all of the employees. We understand Flybe has around 300 direct employees at its bases in Edinburgh, Glasgow and Aberdeen, but to everybody who was employed by Flybe, my thoughts are with them. The Scottish Government will do everything we can to support employees. If employees are facing redundancy, we will provide support through our PACE initiative. Of course, we hope that other airlines will seek to employ former Flybe staff. If I can perhaps just say a word or two about the broader impact. Paul Wheelhouse touched on some of this before First Minister's questions, but we are hoping that connectivity will be maintained by other airlines. For example, Loganair will move to operate several former routes, including connections to Manchester, Belfast and Southampton, and I know they plan to start operating these routes as soon as possible. Later this month, EasyJet will begin new routes between Edinburgh and Glasgow and Birmingham. I should stress, and I think it's important to stress, that no Scottish island routes are affected because these are operated by Loganair, not Flybe. And the Aberdeen-Wick route has been mentioned, and it is operated by Eastern Airways. That was under a franchise agreement with Flybe, but Eastern Airways has confirmed that they intend to continue to operate the route. So this is a serious situation, particularly for the staff, and the Scottish Government will do everything we can to support them.
And Bob Doris.
Presiding Officer, universal credit claimants who are unwell or self-isolate as a result of coronavirus must update their online portal and provide medical evidence by day 8 if they miss an appointment or cannot fulfil their claimant commitment. It is unclear how medical evidence can be secured when self-isolating, and there is concern over how claimants who have caring responsibilities as a consequence of coronavirus will be supported. This will not be easy for DWP staff either, Presiding Officer. First Minister, will the Scottish Government make constructive representations to the UK Government to ensure that universal credit claimants will not be sanctioned or otherwise in detriment due to coronavirus?
First Minister.
Yes, absolutely, and we will continue to make those representations to the UK Government. In my view, the DWP must review its guidance now and provide clear information to everybody that they will not be sanctioned if they can't meet their claimant commitments, if they're following health advice to self-isolate for a fortnight or are caring for people with coronavirus. I'm aware that the UK Government has advised workers without statutory sick pay to claim universal credit if their work is disrupted, but of course waiting 5 weeks for a payment or accruing debt through an advance is not really acceptable, so I hope the UK Government will initiate immediate hardship grants for people in this situation. The Scottish Government is also looking at what we can do to have contingency funding for people who are in that kind of position. We simply can't have people feeling that they must work against medical advice because the welfare system is not meeting their needs. The social security system should be a safety net for people when they need it. But in this instance, of course, the actions of individuals have an impact on wider health. So it's really important that these changes are made and that they are made quickly.
Thank you. Question number 3, Alison Johnston.
The Scottish Greens are wholly committed to working with the Scottish Government and with other parties as we face the challenge of the coronavirus, and I very much appreciate the ongoing briefings provided by the Cabinet Secretary and the Chief Medical Officer at this very busy time. This week, the skies over Fife were ablaze from flaring at ExxonMobil's plant at Mossmorran. This light pollution affects communities up and down the east of Scotland, and for the people living in the shadow of this fossil fuel relic, their lives have been made a misery. NHS Fife has said that the plant has a direct impact on the health and well-being of people there. My colleague Mark Ruskell has repeatedly asked for ministers to visit the communities who are suffering, but the Scottish Government has refused. The Greens have also called for an independent inquiry into the future of Mossmorran. So will the First Minister finally agree to these simple requests, or is she too close to the fossil fuel industry to hold them to account?
First Minister.
I think this is a really serious situation, and I think the tone of that question probably doesn't do justice to the seriousness of it. Can I remind Alison Johnston that, as far as I understand it, SEPA, which is an independent regulatory body, is now focused on concluding an ongoing criminal investigation to an evidential standard and are continuing to scrutinise different actions. There are ongoing regulatory investigations, so that the combination of these things mean that it's incumbent on ministers to be very careful that we do not act in a way that could undermine that in any way, shape or form, or prejudice it in any way. It is not in any way that ministers are disinterested in this, but we want SEPA to be able to do its job and to be able to do its job properly. As I said to Annabel Ewing, who has been assiduous in raising this on behalf of her constituents, I am extremely concerned about the situation, and I understand the concerns of local residents. It's important that SEPA continues to take the action it thinks it's necessary, and it's important that the operator takes all necessary steps to reduce the impact on residents and address these concerns. And I hope that all members across the Chamber would accept the importance of allowing all of these processes to take place properly.
Alison Johnston.
With the greatest of respect, First Minister, expressing disappointment doesn't help people in this area sleep at night. It doesn't do justice to the seriousness of the situation. The First Minister mentions the Scottish Environment Protection Agency. Let me read SEPA's response. Having been clear that flaring must become the exception rather than routine, we're disappointed that flaring by ExxonMobil has occurred again. First Minister, our environmental regulator should be protecting our communities, not tweeting their disappointment from the sidelines. SEPA have issued warning after warning. They issued a final warning as long ago as April 2018. But the situation on the ground hasn't changed. You can go and visit this community, First Minister. Paul Wheelhouse has met with ExxonMobil to discuss the situation. The community are well aware of that. But either SEPA aren't up to the job of protecting our communities, or they don't have the powers to do so. Which is it, First Minister? And what will you do to end the misery this plant is still causing?
First Minister.
It's neither of those things. SEPA is taking action. It is right to take action, and it has a responsibility to ensure that local residents are properly protected. I would not be doing any good to local residents if we in any way acted in a prejudicial manner to the ongoing investigations, regulatory and/or criminal investigations that are underway there. My interest is in making sure this issue is addressed, that it is addressed properly and safely, and is addressed for the long term. And as First Minister, that's what I'm going to make sure the Government focuses on.
Thank you. We've got some further supplementary questions. James Kelly to be followed by Maurice Corry. James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've been approached by a number of members of the Fire Brigade Union who are concerned at the breakdown of talks between the FBU and the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service on the latest pay and conditions proposal. Due to pressures on the health and social care budget, firefighters have been asked to take on additional duties to deal with trips, slips and falls, and also medical emergencies. Understandably, they have rejected the latest offer as inadequate to meet the enhanced responsibilities. Firefighters operate in very difficult circumstances and deserve to be treated fairly and properly. Can I ask the First Minister if she accepts that firefighters are due a fair settlement, and if the Government will take immediate action to ensure that the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service return to the negotiating table immediately to resolve the dispute?
First Minister.
Well, of course, the transformation plans are not about cuts to services. It's about reflecting the modern role of our firefighters who do such an excellent job across our country. Following extensive negotiations between the Fire Service and the FBU over the last 2 years, an offer was made in November, which has now been rejected by the FBU. Paying conditions of firefighters is a matter between the employer and the FBU. We had hoped a deal could be reached in Scotland that would have given firefighters a fair pay award, for which the Scottish Government was providing the funding for broadening their role to enable the service to respond to changing risks and to do more to keep communities safe. And I should say Scotland is actually the only part of the UK that has offered additional funding for expanding the role of firefighters. So I hope that negotiations continue. It's for the fire service to decide how these should continue, but respecting and valuing the role of our firefighters is the absolute priority in all of this.
Maurice Corry, to be followed by Pauline McNeill.
Presiding Officer, veteran suicide has been dubbed the epidemic of our time by military officials. Over the past 2 months, 14 former and serving British military personnel are thought to have taken their own lives. It is likely that many of these 14 individuals suffered from delayed onset of post-traumatic stress disorder. Considering these tragic events, the UK government has brought in and brought forward their plans for a high-intensity mental health programme. Can the First Minister confirm any plans to provide a similar mental health programme to help our veterans with serious service-related illnesses like PTSD in Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, I'm glad that the UK government is taking what of course, principally is its responsibility, given the reserved nature of this, seriously. The Scottish Government also takes this very seriously. The health, mental and physical of our veterans is of paramount importance. I have appointed a Veterans Minister. Graham Day has that responsibility. We have a Veterans Commissioner in Scotland. We do a range of work to support our veterans, and I think that is absolutely right and proper. And of course, the work we do to support veterans in Scotland has been widely commended and praised. I'm very happy to ask Graham Day, as the Veterans Minister, to correspond or indeed to meet with the member to discuss what more we can do in Scotland to support our veterans, who absolutely deserve not just our appreciation but our ongoing support, and to be encouraged, of course, to continue to make a contribution to society after they leave our armed forces.
Pauline McNeill, to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Last year it was reported in the press that adverts explicitly seeking sex for rent were appearing online, and as a result of these reports, websites such as Craigslist enhanced the filters they apply to stop the practice. However, landlords are still seeking sex for rent through online ads by euphemistic terms such as rent for fun. But Living Rent have reported that 2,000 women are offered rent in exchange for sex every year. I've seen these adverts for myself, deliberately targeting vulnerable people, and this is the key point, by claiming that the arrangement is perfectly suited for students or people who are struggling for money. Does the First Minister agree with me that this practice is immoral and it should be against the law to prey on vulnerable men and women who are struggling for money? If a gap in the law exists, I urge the First Minister if she would speak to the Lord Advocate to legislate against advertising sex for rent.
First Minister.
Well, I do believe that adverts of this nature are immoral, and I absolutely agree with Pauline McNeill's sentiments on this. Forcing someone in any way, and I stress in any way, to participate in sexual activity is a crime already, and it's the kind of behaviour that is completely unacceptable, deplorable and immoral, but also illegal. Where evidence exists, it is for the police to investigate that and for the Crown Office to decide whether to prosecute. I'm sure the Lord Advocate will pay attention to the specific request that Pauline McNeill has made, although the issue of whether or not there needs to be and should be further legislation would be a matter for this Parliament to take, not for the law officers to take. In terms of the practice, we have already taken action to seek to very directly challenge this practice. Kevin Stewart in 2017 wrote to the online platforms, including Craigslist and Gumtree, to draw their attention to the unacceptability of it. Gumtree responded. Disappointingly, Craigslist did not respond, although I understand they have discontinued their personals section. But either way, this is unacceptable behaviour. It needs to be dealt with criminally where that is appropriate. And I think all of us should join together to make any company engaging in this absolutely aware of how unacceptable Parliament finds it.
Kenneth Gibson.
First Minister, as you will know, this is Endometriosis Awareness Week in Scotland. 1 in 10 women of childbearing age suffer from endometriosis, an often painful and debilitating gynecological condition, which astonishingly 74% of men and even 33% of women are unaware of. On average, it takes 7.5 years for this often idiosyncratic and distressing condition to be diagnosed. There are now 3 specialist endometriosis centres in Aberdeen, Edinburgh and Glasgow. What further action can the Scottish Government take to improve the diagnosis and treatment of endometriosis?
First Minister.
Well, this is a debilitating condition and one which many women for far too long have suffered in silence. As the Scottish Government, we are committed to making improvements for people who have the condition and therefore we're contributing funding to a number of research programmes to investigate both causation and treatments. Work is also underway to raise awareness, enable quicker diagnosis and improve access to care and support. That includes the 3 specialist endometriosis centres that offer multidisciplinary treatment for people with complex endometriosis, as well as the development of expertise within primary care, cluster groups and more support for self-management of the condition. In addition, this year we are developing a women's health plan as part of the programme for government that will set out further actions to address all health inequalities faced by women, including those living with endometriosis.
Thank you. Question number 4, Gillian Martin.
Presiding Officer, to ask the First Minister how important the Scottish Government considers the agricultural sector is to the country's economy, society and international reputation.
First Minister.
Scotland's agricultural sector is hugely important to Scotland generally and...
All right, we're just going to have a very, very short suspension. A very short suspension. I think Parliament can resume now. First Minister, had you finished that answer or should we go to the supplementary question?
I hadn't even started it.
You hadn't started it, okay. If you can remember the question, First Minister.
Scotland's agricultural sector is hugely important to the country as a whole and to our rural economy in particular. Farmed produce makes a significant contribution to our food and drink success story, which reached record turnover levels in 2018. Farming also helps shape our landscape, helping to make Scotland a destination of choice for many international visitors.
Lynne Martin.
I thank the First Minister for that answer. First Minister will have heard the very worrying comments from a UK Treasury advisor that the agriculture and fishing sector is of, and I quote, low value. The 6,000 plus people who work in those sectors in my area do not consider their work to be of low value, and those of us who trust the quality of their produce on our supermarket shelves also do not consider our food producers to be of low value. And indeed, in international markets, certainly prize the value of Scotland's food and drink. Many people in my constituency and the wider Scottish agricultural sector are deeply worried about the messages coming from Westminster about their sector. The First Minister is, I'm sure, concerned about where the UK Government's priorities lie when they negotiate post-Brexit trade deals. Is she, like me, coming to the conclusion that the UK Government will do nothing to support our food producers, and that their Brexit project will yield no benefits for those many farmers and fishermen who've put their trust in them? And I ask her, what does she suggest that we do to protect them?
First Minister.
This is a really important issue. The comments that were reported in the press were utterly deplorable and are not shared by this government. We highly value our agriculture and our fishing sectors, and if these comments tell us anything, it's that the promises made to farmers and indeed to fishermen during the EU referendum by Tory Brexiteers were empty promises. By contrast, the SNP is getting on with delivering real benefits for our farmers and crofters. We said we would get the UK Government to return the Convergence funding to Scotland's farmers, and we did. We said we would pay the first instalment before the end of March, and we are. This week alone, Convergence payments worth £86.2 million were made to over 17,400 farmers and crofters, righting a historic wrong. Unlike the Tories, this Government will deliver on our promises, and we will continue to use our powers to protect the interests of rural Scotland.
Question number 5, Graham Simpson.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to Citizens Advice Scotland's statement that council tax is the #1 debt issue it deals with.
First Minister.
Our council tax reduction scheme helps people on lower incomes with the costs of council tax. We have provided over £1.7 billion in funding for this scheme since it began in 2013. During that time, of course, we've seen a reduced number of claims due to the unemployment rate having halved. It's worth noting that the average Bandee council tax in Scotland is £499 less than it is in England, and working age households in England have seen council tax support cut by a massive 24%. I would urge anyone struggling with debts or meeting their council tax bill to get advice from their local advice agency, the Citizens Advice online tool, and contact their council to see if they are entitled to a reduction.
Graham Simpson.
Councils are being forced to increase council tax because of years of underfunding by this government.
This is a question, please.
They don't like it, presiding officer. Now,
let's hear the question, please.
Spice estimate the increase in council tax revenue across Scotland will have been roughly 21% between 2016-17 and 2020-21. 21%. That's a lot. So it's little wonder that we now have people in council tax poverty, and yet the numbers using council tax reduction scheme, I'll repeat that because they don't want to listen to it, the numbers using the council tax reduction scheme mentioned by the First Minister have been falling ever since it was introduced in 2013. Now, sadly, the First Minister won't agree to stop the council cuts, but would she agree to work with organisations like Citizens Advice Scotland to promote the scheme and help lift people out of a sea of debt?
First Minister.
Well. If council budgets are under pressure, it's because of a decade of Tory austerity. And I should say they are under considerably less pressure in Scotland than they are where the Tories are in government in England because of the relative protection we've been able to give to local government budgets. And of course, this afternoon we will seek approval of this Parliament for a budget that delivers a real terms increase in the funding available to our local councils. Secondly, council tax, of course, in Scotland was frozen under the SNP government for a decade. And today, average Bandee council tax is literally £500 lower in Scotland than it is in England. We also continue to provide support for people on low incomes, unlike in England. Here's what the Institute for Fiscal Studies said January last year on localised council tax support schemes in England, where I remind people that the Conservatives are actually in government. They said this: "This is the first time since the poll tax that many of the lowest income households have been required to pay local tax." That is shameful, and that's the reality of Tory government. By contrast, the SNP keeps council tax bills lower than in England, and we provide support to low-income households, which is why most people continue to prefer the SNP over the Conservatives.
Andy Whiteman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the First Minister agree with me that one of the reasons for the levels of council tax debt is that council tax remains the most regressive tax in the UK, which contributes to the fact that the poorest 20% of the population pay more as a percentage of their income than the top 20%? And does she agree with me that the council tax should be scrapped as soon as possible?
First Minister.
Well, we have endorsed the Commission on Local Tax Reform's conclusion that the present system should end. We want to see a consensus in Parliament on what could replace the council tax. And in order to make progress, we have sought to convene cross-party talks on identifying a replacement that could be supported by Parliament, and that process is ongoing. If there is agreement on a replacement for the present council tax, and I hope that is the case, we would be prepared to publish legislation by the end of this Parliament, with that legislation being taken forward in the following Parliament. I know the Greens are on board with that, and I would encourage other parties to get on board with it as well.
And question 6, Jackie Bailey.
To ask the First Minister for what reason Scottish Enterprise has suspended new grant funding for business.
First Minister.
Due to their success in stimulating a high level of demand for strategic investment, the Scottish Enterprise budget for the current financial year is now fully committed. That actually indicates that Scottish Enterprise have managed their budget well, ensuring that they are maximising spending to support the economy. With anticipated in-year transfers and income, Scottish Enterprise anticipate that the total budget for 2020-2021 will be £340 million. That will be used to support key strategic projects such as advanced manufacturing and the Michelin Scotland Innovation Park, to continue to boost vital investment by companies in R&D and to support company growth. Scottish Enterprise will also be providing a range of online advice and support to many more companies than at present.
Jackie Bailey.
I fear the First Minister has been misinformed, because the budget for 2020-21 for Scottish Enterprise has been cut by £42 million. That's a cut of almost 17% compared to this year's budget. The consequence is that the budget for grants to businesses next year is already legally committed. There is no new money, nothing at all for anything new. Given the likely economic impact of Brexit, never mind coronavirus, does the First Minister consider that this is very short-sighted, and what will she do to provide adequate resources for Scottish Enterprise to support the economy?
First Minister.
Well, of course, we are supporting sustainable and inclusive economic growth, and we're doing that with a 13.8% increase in our overall economic development budgets, which includes Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, South of Scotland Enterprise, and of course the new Scottish National Investment Bank. The resource budget for Scottish Enterprise for the year ahead, of course, takes account, amongst other things, the significant transfer of resources and functions from Scottish Enterprise to the new South of Scotland Enterprise, and also the establishment of the Scottish National Investment Bank. And capital spend has been maintained to reflect their planned activities within their allocation. Scottish Enterprise has got a fantastic track record of supporting companies and supporting economic growth, and they will continue to have that good track record well into next year and well beyond.
Thank you very much. That concludes First Minister's questions. We're going to move shortly to
How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a balanced stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
The work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.